Both plants and animals need a constant supply of oxygen. Oxygen releases energy from the nutrients we obtain from food. This process whereby energy is produced and oxygen is consumed is known as aerobic cellular respiration. Energy is released when glucose reacts with oxygen to form carbon dioxide and water. Birds and mammals use about 64% of their energy released as thermal energy to maintain a constant body temperature. The remaining energy, about 36%, is stored in molecules known as adenosine triphosphate. Gas exchange is the process when oxygen diffuses into the body cells and carbon dioxide diffuses out of the body cells. In simple organisms, such as sponges and jellyfish, gas exchange is direct, as all of the cells are in contact with the surrounding environment. In more complex animals, such as humans and fish, not all of their cells come in contact with the external environment. These organisms have special organ systems allowing gas exchange to occur in every cell of the body. In these organisms, gas exchange occurs at two locations, the lungs and the body cells. The human respiratory system is a representation of mammalian respiratory systems. Lungs are the main organs of the respiratory system. Lungs provide a respiratory membrane through which diffusion can occur, a huge surface area, and a good supply of blood. The lungs are confined within the thoracic cavity and are protected by the ribcage. Every breath of air is filtered, warmed, and moistened as it flows through the nose and mouth. This prevents damage to the soft, delicate tissues of the respiratory membrane. Located in the nasal passages are tiny hairs and mucus which filter out and capture dust and other airborne particles. As air travels from the mouth or nasal passages, it enters the pharynx. During breathing, the glottis remains open, allowing air to flow into the trachea. The trachea is a tube of soft tissue wrapped around bands of cartilage that support the trachea, holding it open. The walls of the trachea are lined with mucus-producing cells and cilia, which act as additional protection and prevent foreign material from entering the lungs. The mucus is a sticky material that traps airborne particles, while the cilia uses wave-like motions to sweep trapped material upwards, where it can be swallowed or expelled by coughing and sneezing. The trachea branches into two bronchi, each connecting to a lung. The lungs are easily damaged, but the ribcage, spine, and pleura protect them from harm. Inside the lungs, bronchi branch off into a series of smaller branches called bronchioles to form a tree-like network ending in millions of tiny sacs called alveoli. Every cluster of alveoli is surrounded by a network of tiny blood vessels called capillaries. As oxygen enters the alveoli, it has a normal body temperature of around 37 degrees Celsius and is saturated with moisture. The respiratory membrane forming the alveoli is also moist, providing a damp surface through which oxygen can dissolve and diffuse into the blood in the capillaries. The respiratory membrane is very thin, with many capillaries surrounding the alveoli, providing a good supply of blood, making the structure ideal for gas exchange. Ventilation serves two purposes. It obtains oxygen and removes carbon dioxide. Ventilation is based on negative pressure. Air always flows from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. When the atmospheric pressure is higher than that of the lungs, the air is forced into the lungs. Conversely, when the atmospheric pressure is lower than the pressure in the lungs, air is forced out of the lungs. The diaphragm is a large dome-shaped sheet responsible for creating these pressure differences. During inhalation, muscles work to expand the chest. The diaphragm contracts, flattening and pushing down the abdominal muscles, while the external intercostal muscles located between each rib pull the chest up and out. As the lung increases in size, their pressure drops and atmospheric air rushes in to equalize the pressure. Normal exhalation does not usually involve any work of the body. The diaphragm relaxes, arching up like a dome, pushing up against the lungs. The external intercostal muscles also relax and the ribs fall, returning to their resting position. This causes the lungs and chest wall to recoil like elastic. As the size of the lungs decrease, the air pressure increases, resulting in a rush of air out of the lungs and into the atmosphere. During strenuous activity or forced exhalation, the intercostal muscles begin contracting and relaxing as well. When they contract, they pull the rib cage down, causing the pressure inside the lungs to increase and force more air out of the lungs. During ventilation, the lungs are constantly moving within the thoracic cavity. This movement might cause a friction problem if it were not for the pleural membranes. Pleural membranes cover the lungs and line the thoracic cavity. The space between the pleural membranes is called the pleural cavity, which is filled with fluid to prevent the membranes from separating and enable them to slide past each other. Most of the time we are unaware of the action of breathing. The involuntary rhythmic reflex action as the lungs expand and shrink is controlled by the respiratory center in the brainstem. These respiratory centers send signals causing the diaphragm and external muscles to contract, causing inhalation. The stretch receptors in the lungs sense when the lungs have expanded enough and send signals to the brain to indicate the increased volume. The brain then sends signals back to the lungs to begin exhalation. When we hold our breath, talk, or sing, we override these signals. The override is controlled by other centers in the brain. Breathing is automatically adjusted in depth and rate in order to meet different levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide. For example, carbon dioxide can form carbonic acid, which lowers the pH of the blood. Receptors in the brain detect when the pH levels decrease and trigger signals to increase the breathing rate and volume of inhalation for larger intakes of oxygen. When the supply of oxygen in the surrounding atmosphere is low, the kidneys increase the secretion of a substance called erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is a hormone that stimulates the production of red blood cells, therefore increasing the amount of oxygen that can be absorbed from the air and delivered to the body cells. Air moves from the atmosphere in the lungs when the air pressure is lower in the lungs. The partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli is significantly higher than the partial pressure of oxygen of the blood in the capillaries. This pressure gradient causes oxygen to diffuse from the air into the alveoli into the liquid component of blood called plasma. Oxygen is in the plasma. It binds with hemoglobin in red blood cells, while a small amount of oxygen travels freely in the plasma. Hemoglobin is the protein in red blood cells that circulates oxygen around the body. When oxygen-rich blood reaches the body tissues, oxygen molecules attached to the hemoglobin in the red blood cells separate from the hemoglobin. These oxygen molecules dissolve in the blood plasma, then they diffuse into the tissue fluid and from there into the tissue cells. However, there is still some oxygen that remains in the bloodstream. This is how we are able to survive for a few minutes without taking in air. Carbon dioxide is produced in the body cells as a byproduct and follows the opposite path of oxygen while traveling about 20 times as fast. Carbon dioxide diffuses into the tissue fluid, then into the capillaries where the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is lower. Carbon dioxide can travel in one of three ways. 7% travels in the bloodstream, dissolved in the plasma. 20% attaches to hemoglobin to form carbaminohemoglobin. The remaining 73% reacts with water in the plasma and forms carbonic acid, which quickly separates into bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. An increase in hydrogen ions increases the acidity, which becomes a serious problem. As a result, hemoglobin releases remaining oxygen molecules, allowing hydrogen ions to attach to the hemoglobin. In the lungs, the hydrogen ions separate from the hemoglobin molecules and diffuse into the blood plasma to reform carbon dioxide and water. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide is lower in the alveoli than in the blood plasma in the capillaries. This causes carbon dioxide from the capillaries to diffuse into the alveoli, then travel out into the atmosphere. Some diseases of the respiratory system include cystic fibrosis, lung cancer, and pneumonia. Pneumonia is an inflammatory condition of the lungs affecting the lining of the bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli. The infection is caused by bacteria, viruses, or fungi, which causes pus and mucus to accumulate in the alveoli, preventing gas exchange. Symptoms include coughing, fever, chest pain, and difficulty breathing. Diagnosis is often based on examination of the mucus in the respiratory system or phlegm that is coughed up from the lungs.